Hey there, welcome to CNA's Money Talks podcast. I'm your host, Andrea Hing. Now, I've often wondered what it might have been like if I had gone overseas to study. Obviously, I didn't, but I listened to stories regaled to me by my friends who have done so, talking about their cultural exchanges with their schoolmates, being taught by international teachers. I mean, just the overall experience of living in another country. And then things take a turn when I ask them how much it cost. And then my eyes widen. Now, you may be a parent listening to this podcast or this episode, thinking of sending your child to university overseas someday. Or you might be a student who's a bit clueless and intimidated, overwhelmed maybe, of how much it costs, where to start planning, and how to afford an overseas education, especially if you're not equipped with a scholarship, for example. So today on Money Talks, we are here to help you make that financial dream come true, hopefully map out that financial route as well, if that is in fact your goal, to study overseas. Joining me today is Dr. Chan Khai Leok. He is director of theRightU, that's capital U. It's an education consultancy, so we're lucky to have him here as well. Hello, Dr. Chan.
Thank you for having me here.
It is our pleasure. Thank you for being in our Money Talks hot seat today. What do you think of the notion that studying overseas is a privilege for the wealthy?
Well, it is true that, studying overseas can be quite an expense. There are a lot of different considerations to take into. There are many cost components that you have to consider. So financial planning is important. But fortunately, there's actually many sources of funding that is available to you.
So is it even possible then for the average person like me, whose parents earn a modest income, we live in an HDB flat, wondering if, studying overseas, that's going to be a financial burden that wipes out savings, for example?
Well, yes, it's a financial undertaking, but fortunately, there are many sources of funding available.
Mm-hmm.
If you're academically strong, there are literally hundreds of overseas scholarships that's available in Singapore. The government offers that. You can find them through statutory boards, GLCs, even private companies.
Yeah.
So if you look at Bright Sparks, for example, on an annual basis, they compile a very comprehensive list of overseas scholarships that's out available for students to apply to.
Oh, that's great. Okay, that's really heartening to know. What are the top 3 costs to consider when we're applying to study abroad?
Studying abroad is an academic endeavor for the student, but it is equally a financial endeavor for the family.
Yes.
As I mentioned, there's a lot of cost components involved. You have to be very careful. The last thing you want to do is to run out of funds midway through your studies.
Exactly.
Now, the biggest component is arguably the tuition fees.
Right.
So this is the fees that you pay to the university. Now, the fees can vary quite a bit. Different countries have different cost averages, some more than the others.
Yeah.
But also, depending on the university that you're going to.
Right.
Some of the higher ranked universities, they can cost a lot.
Of course. It's all in the brand, right?
You have to hire the best professors.
Of course,
and of course, those are expensive. But you also have universities that are private in nature, meaning they do not get any fundings other than those from tuition fees from international or domestic students.
Right.
Those tend to be a little bit more expensive than public universities.
I see. Wondering if the location is a factor as well, say between Australia versus further west in the UK and the US. Does that also play a part in the cost for us to consider?
Well, in terms of tuition fees, not really. Some universities are located in far-flung places,
yes,
but they are highly ranked, and so they can be really expensive. Or they are small kind of private colleges in the US. Those are extremely expensive as well.
Okay.
So it doesn't really correlate with the city per se. But we're going to touch on living expenses, and that relates to the city.
Correct. So I'm thinking about the cost of living as well in whatever city you choose to study in. Living in Australia versus living in the US, in New York, if you go to NYU, for example, right? It's going to be different.
Living expenses is a big component that you need to consider. It's the second biggest component. You're talking about, accommodation. You're talking about food, groceries that you purchase.
Transport as well.
Transport, absolutely. What some students have done very smartly is they would do their first degree in a place that is relatively affordable.
Okay.
And then they top it up with a master's in perhaps, a slightly more prestigious university or one that is a little bit more expensive, but that's just a top up.
What determines when and whether they even do that top up? Is it cost again, or is it down to whatever they choose to decide to study? Or is it down to just padding up their resume at the end of the day, right? I've gone to a pretty prestigious school as a top up.
Yeah, well, it's partly that, getting that branding to your CV. That's sometimes important. I mean, it's very superficial if you can think about that, but that's what the employers look for.
Yeah, that's
sometimes.
what the hiring managers catch. It catches their eyes.
Indeed.
Yeah.
But it's also for personal kind of enlightenment, knowledge gaining, particularly if you want to go into an area of specialization, which your undergraduate degree do not cover.
Yes.
In that case, you probably want to top it up, with an area that is very targeted, that allows you to go into a specific field.
Okay.
That only with an accredited, degree or a specific knowledge you're eligible.
Let's now crunch the numbers for the day-to-day expenses, Dr. Chan.
For sure.
How much should we set aside for daily spending? We talked about it earlier, right? Food, transport, social activities as well. Got to have a life when we're living overseas, right? I mean, how should we budget this? Can you perhaps give us a ballpark range?
All of these fall within the living expenses kind of category. Now, among them, accommodation takes up the bulk of it.
Yes.
Right? Accommodation comes in various shapes and sizes. Some of them are offered by the university, and these can be relatively low cost. And there are some that are offered by private, student accommodation providers. Very specialized, very nice rooms, but can be a little bit more costly.
Yeah.
So in terms of the approximate cost, I mean, let's take Australia, for example. Sure. I mean, Australia is the number one destination, so it's a good benchmark.
Yeah.
So a typical room, if you want to stay frugal, you can have a room that is shared with, one or two housemates. Essentially, you share your bathroom, toilets, kitchen area, and so on. These can go down to as low as 150 to 200 Australian dollars a week.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But if you want to live like a prince, that's entirely possible.
Have your little ensuite going on.
Indeed. A studio that's self-contained, comes with kitchen, bedroom, a nice TV.
I feel like I'm browsing Airbnb all of a sudden.
Well, that can cost up to $700 to $1,000
a
week.
Wow.
Food is variable as well. If you do takeouts, if you eat in restaurants, they can cost anywhere between $10 to $20 a meal. Pretty much like in Singapore.
Yeah, very similar.
There's not many hawker centers, so you don't get many low-cost meals.
There's no coffee shop downstairs or the void deck across you.
Indeed.
Yeah.
But if your accommodation has catered options, meaning they might provide 10 or 20 meals a week, you might want to take up that option because it's a flat fee. Food is ready available for you. Often, relatively healthy, so that's good. But more often than not, students choose to buy their groceries from the supermarket.
Yes.
They learn some cooking.
Yeah.
A few folks will, gather in the kitchen.
Yeah.
That's actually part of the fun of, studying overseas,
that's
hanging
what
out.
I was about to say that. I mean, it's not just a cost saving or cost efficiency thing, but it's also the experience, right? I'm wondering also, you talked about Australia. Are living expenses maybe more expensive in, say, London and New York again, the bigger cities?
I mean, if you talk about living expenses, then on average, you'll be looking at perhaps roughly about 16 to 20,000 Singapore dollars anywhere else in the UK.
Okay.
But in London, you're looking at closer to $30,000.
Wow, that's almost double.
So that's a lot.
Wow, that's a lot.
I mean, if your institution provides, some relief in that they have, some on-campus accommodation, that's great. But that's not often the case in London because prices are so high.
Obviously, one of the options to help with the finances for any student is part-time work. They'll have to juggle this with school as well. So what would you advise they consider when choosing a part-time job that balances this with their financial needs as well?
Well, it's very common for students to do part-time work. It enhances their CV by a little bit.
Yeah.
But more importantly, I think it allows them to kind of interact with people on the streets, the society. Otherwise, they'll just be in that university bubble.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So
exactly.
it's good experience. On a student visa, you can work upwards of 20 hours a week.
Yep.
So if you average that across every workday, that's 4 to 5 hours every workday. That's very significant if you think about that. So your question is very relevant. Does it make sense, to pack your time with
Correct.
part-time work? As a consultancy, we do not recommend that you pack your time with
Right.
part-time work, because ultimately your study is going to suffer.
Which is what you were there for in the first place, right?
Exactly. So what we advise is do well academically during term time.
Okay.
And then during your vacation, which is months and months, you can work unlimited hours. Essentially you can take full-time work. And that's when, you earn that little bit.
Talking about this, it feels like it confirms the fact that studying overseas is an exercise of independence, essentially. Is this an opportunity for them to start developing some financial goals, right? Can they start trying to achieve these financial goals as well while studying there and trying to pick up some jobs here and there?
I think the whole planning process is a financial exercise.
Yes.
I think thus far, a lot of students would expect education to be laid out in front of them. The Singapore government is very generous in terms of, subsidizing our fees. But I think that whole journey of planning, looking at the tuition fees, summing them up, accounting for hidden cost, all of that, requires some degree of financial prudence
of course.
and awareness.
Yeah.
So that is important in itself. And we have seen some parents, even though they can afford, to pay the tuition fees in its entirety, they would actually choose to take up some loans under the child's name.
Okay.
So that eventually when the child starts working, they can pay back a little bit of that,
Right.
So that gives them some level of responsibility
Of course.
that, expense.
And I think that is the best opportunity for both the parent and the child to inculcate that, right?
Indeed.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up hidden costs, because that was my next question. What are some of the hidden costs that the student, or even by extension parents, don't really think about? And then when they see the bill, or they see that they calculate their expenses and their accounts, and they go, oh, wait a minute, I didn't expect that to be billed. So can you tell us what some of the hidden costs are?
Oh, there's plenty of hidden cost. Typically when a student sets out its budget, we would advise that they put aside additional, 10-20% just to buffer for these hidden costs. Now, one of the biggest cost component I've mentioned is tuition fees. Now, there are some hidden costs in the tuition fees.
Right.
Over the course of, the past 10 to 12 years, we have seen fees increase across the board. So, for example, in the UK, if you dial back the clock, a typical degree program in the UK would have cost anywhere between 13 to 16,000 sterling pounds a year.
Okay.
All right? Maybe that's still manageable. But today, the same program would cost anywhere between 20 to 30,000.
Wow.
So we're looking at doubling of the fees over that period of time.
Is that considered inflation, or is that just the way
we observe that
universities work?
across, all
Right.
universities across most countries.
Right.
So the average kind of price increment or fee increment hovers around 3 to 10%.
Okay.
So if you think about it, if you are a year one student in Australia, if your fees are now about 50,000 a year, and if the increment is at 10%, then by year 3, you're going to be paying 65,000.
Yes.
Imagine that 15K difference. That's significant. Now, another factor is currency exchange.
Yes.
Now, we know that most of the families have their funds in Singapore dollars.
Yep.
So it's actually quite fortunate that we hold Singapore dollars, because the Singapore dollar has been very strong.
Yep.
In fact, it has appreciated over most currencies, over the past 10, 12 years.
Yeah.
So we are in a very good position. It kind of offsets some of the costs that we talked about in tuition fees. But of course, sudden change or reversals in currency does happen.
Yeah.
We've seen that quite a bit.
That's what's happening with the US dollar.
Indeed.
Right.
It can go up to 10% in a very short period of time. So you do have to buffer for that.
Right.
Now, there are also additional expenses that might be incurred during the course of your studies. So, for example, if you're selected, for an internship, or you are, scheduled for an international exchange.
Ah, yes.
Oh.
Yes.
All of a sudden, you have that additional, flight tickets to pay for.
Ah, yes.
You have to pay for your room, food, and so on.
Yeah, in that country.
In that country.
In a different currency.
Indeed. And then the social aspects. I think you mentioned about that a little bit. You might have, friends, you might have buddies who will ask you to go for a road trip, for your next summer holidays, or a skiing trip. That might set you back a couple of $1,000s. And we know that this is also the time where you might meet your boyfriend or girlfriend.
Your significant other.
All of a sudden, your social cost goes up.
Yes. Dating is expensive.
Indeed.
That's true.
And then sometimes you might be unfortunate. You might have to extend your duration of studies. For example, you might have a change of mind in what you want to study. From mechanical engineering to electrical, for example. And then you find yourself having to take additional modules. That extends your time. Now, you might be unfortunate. You fall ill.
Yes, I was about to
during
say.
important moments.
An
you
accident,
fail.
perhaps.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And you have to do a remod. That pushes your schedule back.
Yeah.
And that reminds me of a situation we just had recently.
Oh, wow.
A student, unfortunately, he was not mentally well.
Oh, dear.
He went through a difficult period of time. He failed a few modules. He did remods. It didn't help. So he called us up. He said, I wanted to take a leave of absence.
Okay.
So essentially, it is withdrawing from the university for a short period of time.
Right.
Coming back to Singapore, recuperate a bit, and then maybe continuing his studies. Now, you can imagine the expenses involved. Now, in any case, any extension of your course means that you have to stay on for another half a year or a year. And that full suite of living expenses, you'll have to account for that. On top of that, there is additional visa application fee.
Yeah.
You have to pay for additional health insurance,
Yeah.
additional flight tickets.
Yeah.
So all these will slowly creep in to your
Yeah.
budget. It is important to put in some buffer. I think some students keep it really tight. That's not a wise choice because there's just so many, potential unforeseen circumstances.
Okay, so going back to the financing and the source of that financing, immediately we think of study loans that are offered by financial institutions, for example, even some of the grants that are available through the school itself or even scholarships, like you said. But what are some other common sources of funding and what are some of the terms and conditions that are attached to those alternative sources of funding?
Well, they mentioned about study loans. I think that's a very common source of funds to top up, what the family has. Fortunately, there are a few banks in Singapore that offers overseas loans.
Yeah.
But typically, they only cover the tuition fee component and not the living expenses.
Yep.
They also have a cap, and it's capped at, typically a multiple of your guarantor's salary.
Right.
So there's also a limit as to how much you can loan. Right. Now, how do you account for the rest of the cost? I think one very good practice, and we see that quite often in some countries, is that parents take up an endowment plan for their kid. Obviously, this is a very long-term plan. You're talking about 10, 20 years.
Yeah.
But you put in a little every month, and over time it accumulates, and it can pay for quite a significant fraction of that total cost. Right. Yes, that's
going back to some of the bank loans that you talked about, right? The interest rates that are offered by through these study loans, what's acceptable and what's bad? Because I've heard stories of people taking years to pay off their loans. I have friends who studied their masters at Tisch, for example, and they've had to take on study loans that were in the six figures, for example, and they take years of their adulthood paying off that loan. So talk to us about that.
Well, it is a long journey if you decide to not pay a lot, in terms of a principal.
Yeah.
The interest at the moment is around about 4 to 5%.
Okay.
So it is appreciable. I mean, it's relatively high because they have to take into the possibility and the risk that you do not pay back, you run away, for
Of
example.
course, yeah. The defaulting possibility.
But hopefully, with a good set of education, with a good set of qualifications, you'll be able to secure a reasonably good job that will allow you to pay, over time.
Yeah.
And just bearing in mind, I mean, your salaries will accelerate.
Oh, of course,
over the
yeah.
course of time.
And
so
then you
hopefully,
can pay more, a little bit more as you
Yeah.
progress as well, right?
Exactly. I mean, if you think that you have sufficient savings to kind of pay up everything in one shot, yes, there's a little bit of a penalty, but you stop paying that 4 to 5%.
Yeah, that you reduce your financial burden either way, right?
Absolutely.
So we've talked a lot about the US, the UK, and Australia being very popular destinations for studying overseas. But I'm also noticing a growing number of students interested in studying in places like Japan, South Korea, China even. How do costs differ across these different countries and regions?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, by and large, most of our students will still come to us for traditional kind of English-speaking countries,
Sure,
the
yeah.
UK and Australia and so on. Quite natural because we have general familiarity with these countries. All courses are taught in English, so
Yeah.
that's not a concern. And I think it's just that general level of comfort, with
Yeah.
English-speaking countries. But
Yes.
we are increasingly seeing students coming to inquire about course options
Yeah.
in countries that you've just mentioned. Non-traditional, non-English speaking. So what are the options, right? Now, I think the main reason that they're considering this is that they have found out that the cost of education in these countries can be quite low.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is attractive in itself. I mean, we
Sure.
talked about tuition fees, for
Yeah.
example. Now, the fees are low because in many of these countries, the government provides substantial funding
I see.
for their education. They want to make education accessible to all. And so international students benefit from that. In Japan, for example, a lot of the public universities are heavily funded or heavily subsidized
Right.
by the Ministry of Education, Sports Science and Technology. That's called MEX. If you want to attend a course that is taught in English, oftentimes they're not offered in public universities, but there are also private universities in Japan or Korea
Okay.
that are, considerably lower cost than some of the universities that we've been talking about. In terms of absolute cost, we're looking at 12 to 15,000 Singapore dollars a year,
okay.
not more than 20,
Right.
oftentimes. Continental Europe,
Yes.
Germany. There's motivation for a lot of countries to internationalize, their higher education.
Yeah.
To promote intercultural exchanges, to foster global networking.
Yeah.
Well, the outcome is that to get the best and brightest, from around the world, to build, to come to their country to study, eventually to work, and help with
Their
industry,
economy, yeah.
Yeah, indeed. So many domestic students in Germany pay next to nothing
Yeah.
for their studies.
That's right.
Now, if you speak German and you successfully, pass their local exams in German, and you enroll in one of these courses, then you pay next to nothing as well.
Well, that's not going to be me then.
But even if you were to, go for a course that is taught in English, there are many options out there. There are applied science institutions, there are public universities, and even these universities, the cost is quite moderate. We're talking about not more than 20,000 or 25,000 Singapore dollars.
When we as prospective students are considering these alternative options, Japan, Berlin, right, in Germany, what should we find out from these prospective universities in order to save on tuition fees? So obviously we know the tuition fees are significantly lower than the traditional universities we've been talking about, but what else should we consider as prospective students?
Well, one of the things is to look into their scholarships.
Okay.
They're very generous in their scholarships, and it's not to be missed. So in Japan, for example, they are offering literally hundreds of scholarships for overseas students to come and study for, again, next to nothing.
Yeah.
So this is very generous. You see quite a lot of them in Germany as well. So do keep a lookout, for these scholarships. Very attractive.
Now, I'm going to touch on something that's quite current now, Dr. Chan. We know about the ongoing situation in the United States that involves Harvard. These are very prestigious, very well-known schools in the United States. But putting ourselves in the situation of the students and even the parents of the students who are in this situation right now, what should we or what should they do? And if we find ourselves in such a situation, what should we do if we find ourselves in any kind of emergency, including this one? It can be any emergency. It can be a political one like this one in the United States, but it can also be a natural disaster, for example, any kind of political upheaval like we saw in South Korea earlier this year as well. What would your advice be?
Well, the US situation is quite unfortunate because it comes at a time when a lot of new students are planning for the start of the year, and that's the fall intake. But you will quickly see that there are many other institutions who will put out notices saying, "Oh, we welcome Harvard students."
It helps them as well.
Local universities are doing that as well, NUS and NTU. So students have options to transfer.
Okay.
I think that is a fairly viable option. In many cases, credits can be transferred. So even if you are midway through your studies, you will be able to take some of these, credits, modules that you have studied before, and bring them across to another university.
What about the other aspects of the finances that go into studying overseas and you have to bail basically on that country? How do we tie up the loose ends when we decide to evacuate?
Yeah. Well, in terms of the credits that I've just mentioned, I mean, the good thing is that if you don't have to study those modules again, you save a little bit. So in terms of tuition fees, to a certain extent, you might be able to kind of manage that.
Sure.
But living expenses, a little bit tougher because you have to uproot yourself, from somewhere that you already feel comfortable and then moving on to a different country.
Yeah.
Of course, it depends on which city you're moving from and which city you're moving to. In some cases, you might actually be moving to a more affordable city.
Yeah.
So there's potentially cons, but there's potentially pros as well. But I think it's the time that you might need, to make that transition. I think that's time lost, and it means, having to graduate a little bit later.
Yeah, it's an opportunity cost in a way.
Indeed. So that's a bit painful, I think, for some students.
This has been absolutely comprehensive, Dr. Chan. Here's hoping it'll benefit so many students and parents listening as well. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for the opportunity for me to share.
Now, if you know anyone planning to study overseas or already doing so and perhaps overwhelmed with the finances involved, send them this episode of Money Talks. Money Talks is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, as well as Me Listen. Rate us where you find us. Credit to the team: Tiffany Ang, Junaini Johari, Joanne Chan, Hanida Amin, Saya Wind, Shaza Dalila Rahmat. I'm Andrea Heng. This has been the Money Talks podcast.